The real triumph of justice is sometimes very far from the meaning of this phrase that comes to an adequate person's mind. It seems that sometimes law enforcement agencies are not concerned with the safety of people and victims of atrocities, but with creating favorable conditions for criminals. Donatella Colasanti was born on May 12, 1958. She grew up in a working-class family in Rome, Italy. Since childhood, she had a friend named Rosaria Lopez, who was born in 1956. The girls had known each other since childhood, lived in the same neighborhood in families of roughly the same income. They had a lot in common. By 1975, Rosaria was 19 years old. She had already managed to get a job as a bartender. As she was planning to get a college education, she needed the funds. Overall, she wanted to be independent from her parents and support herself. Combining work and studies was difficult, but the student made every effort. Her friend was 17 years old at the time of the events described, so she could not yet be fully employed. The girls spent a lot of time together and had been friends since childhood. They also had mutual friends, one of whom was Gian Pietro Boni. On the 20th of September, 1975, he invited them to a bar where they planned to relax and meet his friends. Here, Gian met his friends named Angelo Izzo, who was 20 years old, and Giovanni Guido, who was 19. The group spent that evening at the establishment. The girls liked the young men their mutual friend introduced them to. The boys told them about another mutual friend who couldn't make it to the party at the last minute. The boys invited the girls to another party to meet this friend and get to know each other better. They decided not to waste time and scheduled the meeting for the next day, the 29th of September, at the house of their mutual friend, Gian Boni. Despite the brief acquaintance, the girls liked the young men so much. They seemed decent and harmless, so both agreed to join the planned celebration. On the 29th of September, 1975, the girls met Angelo and Giovanni near a cinema called Abbazia. At 3:30 p.m., their mutual acquaintance, Gian, did not show up. The boys said that Gian's plans had supposedly changed slightly and he was waiting for them at his house. Donatella and Rosaria, suspecting nothing, agreed to go with them. The girls trusted these boys. Along the way, Giovanni turned in a different direction, but the girls didn't notice at first as they didn't know the exact route. At 6:20 p.m., the group of young people arrived at a villa called Circeo, located on the coast of Circeo in the Punta Rossa area. This place was about 100 kilometers south of Rome. The villa belonged to the family of a friend of the young men named Andrea Gira, who was 22 years old at the time. The boys convinced the girls that this was where they were supposed to meet their mutual friend and the owner of the villa, who couldn't join the party at the bar the day before. And Gian was supposedly swimming in the sea and would be back soon. The boys were so polite and courteous that the girls believed them. It is worth noting that all the young men came from respectable families. Furthermore, they all used aliases. Why this lie was necessary became known much later, when the girls were already trapped. Giovanni Guido was born on the 10th of January, 1956. He was the son of a wealthy official at the time of the events. The young man was studying at the architectural faculty of the local university and lived with his parents. Angelo Izzo was born on the 23rd of August, 1955, into a middle-class family. He lived in Rome. At the age of 13, he became a member of a social movement. He held far-right views and was known for being cruel and aggressive. Members of the community feared him when he was angry, as Angelo had no self-control. At the end of 1969, he and his friend Andrea Gira were expelled from this group. This was because they tried to use the house where the movement was based to hide stolen mopeds. This was not the first incident that could have damaged the entire organization. In the following years, he became even more violent. His list of criminal adventures grew with many episodes. The young man repeatedly organized attacks on the Italian Socialist Party along with other right-wing young people from Rome. In addition, he distributed illegal substances, which he himself willingly used. He repeatedly committed robberies of banks, jewelry stores, and post offices. Most terrifying for Donatella and Rosaria was that Angelo Izzo had repeatedly participated in gang rapes of girls. The method was the same every time and worked flawlessly. They would meet girls through mutual friends, then lure them to a house where they were brutally abused. In 1975, Angelo became a medical student. But the criminal world attracted the budding criminal more. The young man often skipped classes and instead attended parties and bars, moved in dubious circles, and provoked fights with rival groups. His favorite places for parties were events that activists of these organizations held in their homes. This was a scene of true debauchery with alcohol, illegal substances, and political ideological movements, which almost always included the rape and abuse of women. This is the reason why the boys gave the girls aliases instead of their real names, so they could not find out how serious the danger was. Back in 1970, Angelo raped 2 women with accomplices. The criminal was even caught. He was put on trial but received only a 2.5-year suspended sentence. It was believed that his father's money and connections in high circles played a major role in this. Of course, impunity made him increasingly brutal. He feared nothing. Andrea Guerra's life was no less eventful. He was born on the 21st of September, 1953. His father was a building contractor, the owner of a factory producing electrical equipment, a rather wealthy man. He also played water polo at a professional level. He and the Italian national team won many medals. However, his son was more attracted not to career and sporting achievements, but to the far-right political movement. He became involved in it while still in high school. Already in these years, he became the organizer of a group whose main task was to commit crimes. Andrea saw such activity as one of the tools of social influence, a way to make a name for himself and promote the movement. From the age of 16, the young man had serious problems with the law. In particular, in 1970, he was caught for several episodes of hooliganism. This was only the beginning. His ideology was largely built on the legend of the so-called rural gang. He often called himself by the pseudonym Jacques. As one of the leaders of the group, the real Jacques was known for having carried out several kidnappings in Rome to extort money. It was under this name that Andrea Guerra introduced himself to his new acquaintances. He first received official charges for hooliganism, but by 1972, this list was supplemented with armed assault and grievous bodily harm. A year later, he and his friend Angelo Izzo committed an armed robbery for which the young men were caught and even sentenced to 5 years in prison. Unfortunately, money, connections, and an overly lenient justice system played their part here. Just 2 years later, both were released. Unfortunately, the girls did not suspect how dangerous the young men who lured them to the party were. Despite the friendly conversation and pleasant appearance, their intentions were malicious from the very beginning. For the first few hours at the villa, everything went well. The young people talked, listened to music, and drank. Then the boys became heavily intoxicated, used illegal substances, and became noticeably rougher, more aggressive, and bolder. Angelo and Giovanni began to harass the girls. At first, they took it as a joke and simply refused. But when the girls realized the full danger of the situation, it was too late. There was nowhere for them to run. Nevertheless, Donatella and Rosaria refused to voluntarily have sex with them and begged to be let go home. Then, one of the criminals pulled out a gun and pointed it at them, saying that he was a member of a Marseille criminal gang. According to the guy, the head of the organization had ordered their kidnapping. Naturally, at gunpoint, the girls' will was easily broken. Then the real hell began. Donatella and Rosaria were subjected to torture and multiple rapes by Giovanni and Angelo. They were beaten and tortured, threatened with a weapon. Later, the owner of the villa, Andrea, joined them. He also participated in all the torture and violence, which lasted for about 36 hours before this brutal crime came to its conclusion. The girls were drugged with illicit substances. Rosaria was taken to an upstairs bathroom. Here, the girl was once again brutally beaten, and then they began to drown her until she lost consciousness. They tried to strangle Donatella with a belt. They brought her to the point of losing consciousness several times but did not kill her. They were simply tormenting her. When her friend died, the criminals clearly did not intend to leave her alive. However, at some point, they lost interest and got distracted, leaving her unconscious in the living room. The girl regained consciousness and tried to take advantage of the situation. She decided to get to the phone to call for help. Donatella started dialing the emergency number, but just as the dial tone sounded in the receiver, one of the criminals entered the room. She didn't manage to say a word before she was hit on the head with a heavy object. The killer grabbed the first thing he could find, which was an iron metal rod. Donatella fell, bleeding. She showed no more signs of life. Now the killers decided to get rid of the bodies. They wrapped the girls in towels and a blanket, then in bags, and carried them to a white Fiat that was parked outside in the villa's yard. They were thrown into the trunk, after which the criminals got into the car and drove towards Rome. It was obvious that they felt no remorse, as they laughed and joked along the way about there being 2 dead bodies in the car. Finally, the group reached Andrea Guerra's house in the city. They were hungry, so before getting rid of the bodies, they decided to go to a restaurant for dinner. They left the car parked on the street. When the killers entered the restaurant, they met 2 other guys who were members of another movement. A fight broke out between them, provoked by the story's protagonists. It seemed as if they had forgotten that there were 2 bodies in the trunk of the car. They didn't care. It was as if nothing unusual had happened. The trio of criminals had no idea that Donatella Colasanti was actually alive the whole time. After being hit on the head with a metal rod, the girl pretended to be dead to stop the beating. And it worked. As soon as Donatella realized that the criminals had left the car, she waited a bit to make sure they were gone. Then Donatella began to scream and thrash around in the trunk with all her might. Although the victim was beaten and in severe pain, she did not spare her last strength. It was around 11 p.m. There were few people on the street. The chances of someone hearing her seemed low. But she was very lucky, as a security guard was nearby and the noise coming from the car's trunk caught his attention. The elderly man listened, saw blood by the car, and then quickly approached a police car, a patrol of which was nearby at that time. This was another fortunate coincidence that saved the victim's life. As the young men were about to return communicating on the radio, the patrol car relayed the information. At that moment, a journalist who was interested in the case and was nearby overheard the broadcast. Realizing that something serious had happened, he rushed to the scene. The man arrived in time. Law enforcement officers were already there, trying to open the trunk. The screams of the captive were still coming from it. After forcing the car open, they found a bloodied, naked girl inside. She was beaten all over, with a swollen face and in need of medical assistance. Next to her lay the lifeless body of Rosaria. At the hospital, she was diagnosed with several severe injuries, including a traumatic brain injury and a broken nose from the blow with the metal rod. All this time, Donatella was in the trunk, lying on the body of her dead friend. The horror she experienced caused serious psychological trauma. Donatella struggled with the consequences for a long time, but was never able to fully recover. While she was in the medical facility, the girl was afraid that the criminals would return to eliminate her as an unwanted witness and could hardly sleep. Even after being discharged, it didn't get any easier. She was still afraid of the boys' revenge. Giovanni, seeing the crowd around his car, tried to flee but was caught. Angela was also handcuffed. Only Andrea was warned, so he managed to escape. The criminal was declared wanted, but the next day the Carabinieri managed to find the fugitive's relatives, who were cleaning the house of blood. According to the authorities, his mother and brother were covering for him, trying to hide the evidence. They did not report the boys' whereabouts. A theory emerged that he had warned them about what happened and asked for help to hide. Unfortunately, it worked. His relatives bought time, and the trail went cold. The criminals' friends were arrested at that time. They were interrogated about the attack on the girls, but stubbornly denied their guilt. Several months passed. During this period, Andrea was not caught, nor was his location even determined. Suddenly, his friends received a letter in which he assured them that for good behavior they should soon be released, as Andrea had arranged everything with the mafia. In addition, he wrote that the surviving girl would soon die if she was determined to testify against them in court. All this only increased the pressure on the victim. However, Donatella was not going to back down and remain silent. She wanted revenge for her friend's death and her own suffering. The girl had miraculously survived. She realized that without the criminals being caught, she would not be able to live peacefully, fearing their return. Thanks to Donatella's testimony, the Carabinieri were able to almost completely reconstruct the picture of the crime that the group of young men had committed at the country villa. However, the victim's lawyer believed that the trio of rapists and murderers had a chance to escape punishment thanks to their parents' influence. It was necessary to give this case maximum publicity. Therefore, a group of like-minded volunteers against the criminals was formed, led by Donatella's lawyer. In addition, several feminist organizations were present at the trial as a support group. Thanks to their active efforts, as well as Donatella's courage, on the 29th of July, 1976, all 3 were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. Angelo, Guido, and Andrea were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Moreover, Andrea was still on the run at this time, had not yet been caught, and received his sentence in absentia. All this did little to calm Donatella. The girl was very afraid of the criminal's return and revenge on his part, as Andrea was still at large. The police desperately continued to search for him, but without success. After years that Donatella spent in fear and trying to influence the work of the law enforcement system, the Carabinieri managed to find out that Andrea Ghira had fled to Spain almost immediately after the murder. On the 26th of June, 1976, he joined the Spanish Legion, using the fictitious pseudonym Massimo Testardi. He claimed to have been born in Rome in 1955. He even provided a fake document. All this worked. During his service, the man changed several bases. He actively used and distributed prohibited substances. Thus, a severe drug addiction developed. The consequences of systematic use became more and more noticeable. For assault and distribution of prohibited substances, on May 28, 1980, he ended up in prison for 6 months. In 1982, he was sent to Malaga to the Special Forces, then to the militia. Here, Andrea was repeatedly prosecuted for the use and possession of illegal substances. On the 22nd of July, 1993, he began to have health problems. At first, Andrea was hospitalized. The serviceman was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He was discharged from the military due to an unsatisfactory mental state, as well as numerous physical problems. He did not have a passport, so Andrea settled in the city of his last deployment with his girlfriend. The girl had her own small shop. The man quickly spent all the money he had earned during his service. The criminal continued to use illicit substances and died of an overdose on the 2nd of September of that year. His body was found only a week later, on the 9th of September, as he was no longer living with his girlfriend. When the difficult story of this deceitful and dangerous man was uncovered in 2005, the Rome prosecutor's office requested an exhumation of the body. On the 14th of November of the same year, this request was granted. Andrea was exhumed in the presence of local investigators, and then his femur was brought to Rome for analysis. On the 26th of November of the same year, a DNA test confirmed the identity. However, the results of these tests raised great doubts, as it was conducted by a former student, a relative of the criminal on his mother's side. Because of this, Donatella believed that the bone belonged to one of his relatives and that Andrea himself was actually still alive and continuing to carry out his dark deeds in Rome or another city. No explanations worked. The girl still had not recovered from the horror she had experienced and wanted to be sure that she was not in danger. To dispel all doubts, in January 2016, the Rome prosecutor's office reopened the investigation. The body was exhumed again to conduct a more thorough DNA test using advanced techniques from another laboratory. In June of the same year, a report was received that confirmed the results of the previous analysis of the femur. This meant that Andrea Ghira had indeed died and no longer posed a danger to her. The fate of Angelo and Guido was also eventful, despite their imprisonment. In January 1977, the pair of criminals tried to escape from the prison where they were being held. In the process, they took one of the prison guards hostage. Fortunately, their plan was foiled. In January 1986, Angelo made another attempt. At that time, he was in another correctional facility. Despite all these violations and escape attempts, on the 25th of August of that year, Angelo took advantage of a relaxation of his detention conditions. He was granted the right to be released for a short time and did not return to prison. Instead, he fled to France. On the 15th of September, the criminal was caught in Paris and extradited back. Each such incident caused real terror for the heroine of the story. She had miraculously survived the criminal's attack. Now, she didn't know who would finish her off faster, Andrea, who was somewhere unknown, or one of these fugitives. In December 2004, Angelo Izzo was granted full freedom, but his true nature had not changed. Only 5 months passed after that, when on the 28th of April, 2005, his next victims were 14-year-old Valentina Majorano and her 49-year-old mother, Maria Carmela. Both were killed. First, Angelo attacked the woman, then turned to her daughter. Just like 30 years ago, Angelo packed the bodies in bags, but this time, he learned from his mistakes and immediately buried the victims, giving them no chance of survival. On the 30th of April, this crime was solved thanks to the confession of the criminal's accomplice. For the confession, the accomplice received only a 3-year sentence. Investigators believed that the crime was sexually motivated, as the girl was undressed, unlike her mother. Angelo himself claimed that the motive for the crime was robbery. He attacked a woman who refused to give him valuables and money, and he got rid of her daughter as an unwanted witness. Later, detectives began to lean towards the theory that this attack on the woman and her daughter was revenge against his former cellmate, who was an active member of another gang. For the double murder, Angelo was again sentenced to life imprisonment. On the 12th of January, 2007, the relatives of Maria and Valentina believed that the system was to blame for releasing a dangerous monster onto the city streets. After all, Angelo was incorrigible, and that was obvious to everyone. If he had been in prison, the victims would not have been harmed. The family of the murdered victims appealed to the European Court of Human Rights on the 15th of December, 2009. The court found Italy guilty of violating Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights for granting semi-release to Angelo, a prisoner sentenced to a life term. The Strasbourg court ruled that the Italian authorities had violated the right to life of Maria Carmela and Valentina Majorano, who were killed by Angelo when he was at liberty. The judge explained that the protection of the right to life obliges states not only to refrain from causing death voluntarily and unlawfully, but also to take the necessary measures to protect persons under their jurisdiction. The court found that granting semi-release to such a dangerous criminal and the lack of supervision over him had effectively led to the deaths of 2 people. As a result of the trial, the Italian authorities were ordered to compensate the victims' families €45,000 for moral damages. Despite his bloody trail, there were supporters who romanticized his image. For example, in November 2009, a journalist who had been closely following Angelo's criminal activities announced that she wanted to marry him and fight for his freedom. The journalist was convinced of his innocence and was determined to prove it. In March 2010, they were married right in the prison, but the relationship ended about a year later. In an attempt to obtain another mitigation of his sentence, Angelo made a statement before the Anti-Mafia Commission. He told of a girl named Rossella Karadzin, who disappeared on the 21st of August, 1975 at the age of 17. According to the defendant, she had attracted the attention of a Masonic lodge because of her innocence and sweet appearance, and was used for a sacrifice in an initiation ceremony of the Red Rose and Golden Cross Brotherhood. He personally last saw her when the girl was released from the hall after the Masonic ritual. Angelo was sure that her body could be found in the forest, but nothing of the sort was found. No one believed his words. During his imprisonment, he wrote several manuscripts, including a book called Decameron 1075. This so-called novel was painfully reminiscent of the gruesome event involving 3 criminals and 2 girls, Donatella and Rosaria, one of whom did not survive the attack. Giovanni Guido's prison sentence was changed after a successful appeal on the 28th of October, 1980. He now had to serve only 30 years in prison. This leniency was achieved thanks to a statement of remorse, as well as compensation of 100 million lire to the families of Rosaria and Donatella. As early as January 1981, he escaped from prison and went to Buenos Aires. However, he was quickly recognized there. This happened a little less than 2 years later. The fugitive was arrested. He was awaiting extradition, but ended up in a medical center due to hepatitis. It was believed that he contracted this disease during his imprisonment several years before his escape. Taking advantage of the situation, on the 17th of April, 1985, he escaped from the medical institution without waiting for extradition. The next time he was tracked down was in Panama in the summer of 1994. Here he was leading a new life, far from crime, and had become a used car salesman. When the man was recognized, he was extradited back to Italy. Surprisingly, on the 11th of April 2008, Giovanni Guido's sentence was commuted to community service. By this point, he had spent 14 years behind bars. During this period, he received an education, a degree in foreign languages and literature. His sentence ended on the 25th of August, 2009. Such a significant reduction in his term became possible after a pardon. Rosaria Lopez's sister reacted particularly negatively to this decision by the authorities. The woman believed that the regime in which the brutal murderer was held was not strict enough. In addition, the family remained convinced that the criminal had absolutely no remorse for the atrocities he committed. It is obvious that the many years spent abroad after his escape were not taken into account at all. Despite this, the decision and attempts to challenge the pardon were refused to be reconsidered. The villa that became the scene of the crime is now uninhabited. Andrea Guerra's mother sold the house 25 years later to an elderly woman. Then, the villa passed to her son. He tried to turn the house, which is considered a house of horrors, into a studio, but eventually abandoned the idea. Now the villa is abandoned, the gates are rusty, and weeds have almost completely overgrown the property. At the place where 17-year-old Donatella was freed, a memorial plaque and red benches have been installed, symbolizing the fight against gender-based violence. At that time, rape was considered a crime against morality, not against the person. 50 years have passed, and thanks to public efforts, the situation has changed. Now, crimes committed on sexual grounds are considered crimes against the person. Against this background, the fate of the survivor, Donatella Colasanti, looks all the more tragic. While still a minor, she miraculously survived the attack of these three monsters, then spent her whole life in fear, but never stopped fighting. She died on the 30th of December, 2005, from breast cancer. At that moment, she was 47 years old. As her last statement, she declared the call, "Let's fight for the truth." In 2020, her old house was restored. It became a center for combating violence in Rome. If you liked my work, subscribe to the channel. Support this video with likes. Let's discuss this story in the comments. Thanks everyone, and bye.